Welcome. We are here today inside the Newport Mansions, and it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome our guest, Keith Stokes. Keith is a native Newporter. He is the vice president of the 1696 Heritage Group, which is a historical consulting firm dedicated to helping people and organizations who are trying to increase their knowledge and access to unique American heritages. He has a long and distinguished career in business and in historic preservation and community development. He has a degree from Cornell and one from the University of Chicago. He is a frequent national, state, and local lecturer on a variety of community and regional planning issues, along with historic preservation. And he is knowledgeable. This is his hobby, I guess, more than a hobby. Very knowledgeable about African and Jewish American history. Keith has been an advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He serves on the board of the Preservation Society, on the Truro Synagogue Foundation. He has been active with the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission Historical Review Board, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, the Economic Development Corporation, the Quonset Development Corporation, the Rhode Island Foundation, and the Governor's Workforce Board. Keith has helped the Preservation Society, along with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and his wife, Theresa, Soni, Guzmán Stokes, develop a brand new exhibition that is now at Rosecliff called Gilded Age Newport. Gilded Age Newport. And today we are going to be hearing more about that exhibition. And I also want to draw your attention to the fact that on May 16th, Keith and his wife are going to be presenting a lecture called Am I Not a Man and a Woman? The Rise of African Heritage, Political Identity in Gilded Age Rhode Island. And that's going to take place at Rosecliff. You can attend in person or via Zoom, and we'll talk about that later. So, Keith, sorry, that is a long presentation. An introduction, but you are deserving of it all. I guess one final tidbit about Keith that I think Newporters listening to this show will appreciate, because I think everybody listening knows Keith, but you are a 9th generation Newporter. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct on the maternal side. Absolutely.
So Keith really knows this community well, and he has been collecting from this community for many generations. And that's why our exhibition is so great. So you talk a lot about the concept of unrestricted cultural and political interchange. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of what it is you mean by that?
Absolutely, Trudy. During the Gilded Age in Newport, African heritage families were able to unite and promote their economic and social well-being through self-reliance, entrepreneurism, political advancement, cultural interchange. And you begin to see a rise of Black social clubs, literary societies, recreational activities. As an example, the Marathon Club is established in Providence and Newport, and they are able to organize, outfit, and operate their own all-Black youth football clubs, cheerleading clubs, recreational clubs, sporting clubs, and they're having events not only in Newport and Providence, but they're connecting with other African heritage communities in places like New York, Philadelphia, Hartford, Connecticut, New Haven. So I think what's important about the Gilded Age is that it's a time where African heritage people are also flexing their economic stability, and in other cases, expressing that in the forms of their own social, civic, and recreational activities. I mean, Newport had its own all-Black tennis club with tennis matches, not only in Newport, but also in other communities, with the whole goal of fostering what they called social uplift is tied to physical uplift. The more physical recreation activities and outdoor life that children could have, the better sense they would have and better identities they would have as young adults. So this was a very organized strategy that was quite successful in Newport during that Gilded Age era.
And was it rare to Newport? Was it unusual to see this kind of interchange? Or you did mention that they were competing against teams elsewhere. So this must have been stirring throughout the Northeast, or primarily Newport?
It's always interesting when people talk about Black history in America, they almost immediately default to the American South, or they default to the, say, mid-20th century civil rights era. And very few would have any sense that early Black history is as much in New England circumstance than anywhere else in the country because New England's a part of the 13 original colonies. So places like Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, New London, Connecticut, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Newport, Rhode Island had some of the earliest free Black communities in America, well before the American South. In fact, in the case of Newport, you'd have to go back about 100 years earlier before the Gilded Age. And I'll give you a specific date, November 10th, 1780. On that date, a group of free African tradesmen in Newport come together in the home of Abraham Casey on 11th Street. Today, that's Memorial Boulevard. It would be the parking lot of the post office on the corner of Thames and Memorial Boulevard. And those men came together and formed for the first time and chartered the Free African Union Society. We know this because the actual records and minute books still exist in the collections of the Newport Historical Society and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. This African society determined that we are free and we're going to create a new identity as free Africans in America or African Americans. They would reach out to other free African communities in Boston, Philadelphia, and Providence, and eventually New York. And by the end of the 18th century, again, 100 years before the Gilded Age, each of those communities had vibrant free African communities. And it's important to recognize that because this is in the early 19th century when most African Americans are still enslaved. So while you have nearly 4 million African Americans enslaved in the lower South, you have tens of thousands of free African American men and women who are free and exercising that freedom in places like Newport. So Newport is already a well-known and well-earned commodity within the free African community. The other important connection is being a seaport. Being a seaport in the 19th century and even early in the 18th, 17th century, that's not only a place where trade is going on and you're seeing ships and products and vessels from all over the world coming into places like Newport as a port, you're also exchanging information. In fact, I would suggest the sea is the internet of the 18th and 19th century. As we use the internet to exchange information, to search information, to connect with far along places, well, urban seaports were that same place. So Newport was a place where as ships were arriving and departing, they're not only bringing products and commodities, they're bringing information. And for free African communities, they knew that places like Newport had their own church, had their own school, and had a level of freedom that was unprecedented at that time. And that would become literally an internet calling for other African Americans. If I wanted to set up a business, if I wanted to be successful, if I wanted to not look over my shoulder and be concerned with discrimination, Newport was one of those places. So by the time of the Gilded Age, Trudy, Newport was a very well-known place for economic success and civic and social stability for the larger African American community.
That is fascinating. Do you think, Keith, I've heard you talk about this. Do you think that the sort of this goes back actually to the roots of the founding of Rhode Island in general, this place for religious tolerance or tolerance in general, that maybe in our DNA, where people are escaping from Massachusetts and other colonies, there was something that just distinguished the kind of person who came to Newport and to Rhode Island as people with an ability to think in bigger. And I wonder too, you talk about 1780 being such an important year. I think, you know, a huge collection of Quakers were in this community at that time as well, and they were preaching tolerance, and they were talking about not being bigotry and not being against it. I wonder if there were colleagues and friends that crossed over religious lines that helped bring people together.
I think people would like to believe that. In actuality, Newport during the 17th into the 18th century, what we call our golden age of the maritime trade, was the most active slave trading port in all of British North America.
That's true. There's real dichotomy here.
And there's an irony there because as European settlers arrived, and many that would arrive to Rhode Island were persecuted religious minorities, be it Quakers and Jews and other Protestants and such. And Roger Williams at Providence, and certainly Anne Hutchinson and John Clark here at Newport, you know, would establish with our charter in 1663 what we call our soul liberty, the liberty of conscience. But that was only for Protestant Christians. It's also important to recognize that as these men and women would express their freedom for religious concerns, they were all actively engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. My late grandmother, my Newport grandmother, who was a leader in the Gilded Age Black community of Newport, would remind me about Quakers in Newport, 1 foot in the counting house and 1 foot in the meeting house. In fact, some of the most earliest and active slave traders and owners in Newport were Quakers. So it's important to recognize that, yes, there are a significant number of white European settlers who are prospering in early Rhode Island, and particularly in places like Providence and Newport, but they're prospering largely tied to the transatlantic trade or the aftermarket products from that trade, like soap making, chocolate grinding, rum making, all tied to slave plantations and labor in the West Indies, and all tied to the distilling and production facilities of enslaved labor here in Newport. But I think what's most important to recognize, and I tend to remind people, what separated New England generally, but particularly Newport, from, say, the American South and the West Indies and African enslavement, is more to do with our land and our economic system. We don't have an agricultural-based economy here in New England. We have cold weather, we have bad soil, a lot of rock and shale. So it's not the cash crops that are driving our economy like you see in the South and the West Indies. There's no Virginia-based tobacco plantations, Carolina rice plantations, sugar plantations. Those things aren't happening here. So for the most part, the centers of our economic activity during the 18th century, during that peak time, are urban seaports. Places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, certainly New London, Connecticut, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Providence, Bristol, and Newport. So most enslaved Africans and some indentured enslaved indigenous are being trained in the trades that would support an urbanized maritime economy. Yes, we had enslaved working in plantations and farms, but they're not large scale. So most of the enslaved are living, working, worshiping, and eventually dying in urban seaport areas. So by the very nature of that economy, they have access to training and education to be a master carpenter or a barrel maker, or a woman as a seamstress and a sail loft. So having those trade skills and education was of value to the economy. That would have been unheard of and unnecessary in a sugar plantation in the West Indies. It would actually have been unlawful to have access to education and training. So it's this access to education and training is a unique in different circumstances compared to the American South and the West Indies. You also have cohabitation. Again, we tend to default in slavery in America by thinking of the large slave plantation homes and then the slave quarters far and separate and apart. That didn't happen in New England. Almost all enslaved lived in the same household. Now, they lived in what we call today the attic or the garret or in the pantries, but they shared close proximity. The third piece is, by the mid-18th century in the Protestant community, you see one of two what are called Great Awakening movements, which is this new version of understanding Christian Protestant religion and understanding your literally living your life as Jesus would have you. And as a part of that process, they are massively converting indigenous and enslaved Africans to the religion of the master mistress. In Newport, we have primary records from all the leading congregations, from the synagogue to Trinity Church, the Baptist Church, the congregational churches, and they're all converting enslaved Africans into the religion. So by the end of the 18th century, you have Africans who are well-educated and well-trained to be the trade workforce of the economy. They have access to religion, and they're worshiping in the religious meeting houses and places of their master and mistress, and they're cohabitating. All those things would have been unnecessary and unneeded and unlawful in the American South and elsewhere. But by the end of the 18th century, as slavery is waning, you have this very well-trained, educated, organized group of men and women of African descent who almost immediately, when they become free, create African societies, African schools, African churches. So it's more tied to the economy than less tied to a moral conviction. That's not to say there weren't individual men and women. Reverend Samuel Hopkins of Newport of the First Congregational Church, our family owns his 1770 installation sermon by Reverend Ezra Stiles. Samuel Hopkins today is recognized as the first abolitionist in America. He's also one of the founders of one of the early African churches and African societies in Newport. He is a sponsor of sending Africans to the College of New Jersey in 1774 to be educated to become missionaries. So today, if you think about early abolitionist America, we default to the 19th century with William Lloyd Garrison and Charles Sumner and many others. But in fact, it is a Samuel Hopkins in Newport that leads that charge before the American Revolution. So Moses Brown in Providence is another great abolitionist, but they're very few and they're very far distant from their counterparts because, again, the slave trade as a transatlantic economic system, it created a level of wealth and prosperity that was unprecedented at that time. The rationale at that time was better to be enslaved and converted to Christianity than to be a pagan living in Africa. So there was this rationale that it was okay to enslave. In fact, Newport Christian merchants would have a saying that under our belief in God, we don't own your soul, only God owns your soul, but we own your labor. So during your time on this earth, we owe your labor, you're obedient to us. But when you die, we've given you the gift of Christianity, and you'll be equal to us with our souls in heaven with God.
So going back to this 1780 date, when the organization, name it again, was found,
the Free African Union Society.
What was the reaction of the rest of the community to this? It's not an uprising, that's not the correct word, but this statement that was being made that we are going to organize, we are going to commune with each other, we are going to be allies and friends, and we are going to be independent from other entities in Newport. What do you think the reaction was?
Well, we know what the reaction was, and the term is not independent, it's actually interdependence. These Africans were already well interdependent within the community. They're leaders in the workforce, they're co-worshiping. In fact, one man, Okamar Mariku, his enslaved name is Newport Gardner. He's converted into Samuel Hopkins First Congregational Church. He becomes a member of the vestry there. He writes hymns and sings hymns. He actually creates his own hymns and music in Newport. He's a music teacher for both Black and white children in the 18th century. The home that he taught music still exists today on Division Street, called the Boers House. So you already had a level of interdependence. And I want to be clear, Trudy, interdependence is not integration.
Right.
People of African descent did not want to live, work, and worship in the larger white community on a equal basis. They weren't looking for that. They were looking for just the opportunity to have their own freedom and their own freedom of choices of how they lived, how they worked, and how they would worship. And that's how they would create in Newport, earlier than other communities, the Free African Union Society is 1780. By 1808, Newport and Boston create the first free African schools, meaning African-owned, African-taught, and more importantly, we still have the records of the African children who participated in that school, which existed on what is today called School Street in the Hill community. So I just want to be clear to the fact that there wasn't a competition between Black and white for land, for shared spaces, for resources, for jobs. They were already in place in providing the critical jobs and support base that kept all Newporters, Black and white, prosperous. That's interdependence, not integration.
And let's go back to the exhibition at Rosecliff, because I think that is the main point that you and the Black Heritage Society are trying to make. Let's actually step back for a minute. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, because very important and unique organization in Rhode Island that probably is underappreciated. And I think this partnership that we have with Rhode Island Black Heritage is a very, very important one right now. But tell us a little bit about the organization.
Now, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, which was established in 1975 in Newport,
right.
The founding directors is Rowena Stewart, and her
Many
vision
people listening would know her name, right?
And Rowena, who was my mentor, my mom was my mom and the late Eleanor Keyes in Newport were all part of the founding directors of the society at that time. And the vision was, as we were coming towards the 1976 bicentennial, that we should also recognize African heritage or Black contribution to Rhode Island national history. So with that, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society partnered with the Rhode Island Historical Society, late Al Clyburn, a visionary, men and women such as the late Mike Van Leesten, Paul Gaines, Fred Williamson. I mean, I'm a kid in high school and they're all my mentors. And they had a vision to create a society to be able to tell the story of Black history in Rhode Island and be able to collect and preserve and interpret Black artifacts and heirlooms. It started originally, very few people realize this, it originally started at the Mount Zion AME Church at its old Turrell Chapel on the corner of K Street and Bellevue Avenue. It actually sat behind the Hebrew Cemetery there. That's where it started. In 1970, there was a fire, it was lost, and the general feeling was we should move it to Providence, which had a larger Black community at that time.
There was a fire in that building, you mean?
Yeah, the building was lost,
Oh,
unfortunately. But the general feeling was Providence had the larger Black community. It was our capital. It was more of an urban area. It was easier to get to than Newport. So the general feeling was that that would be the place. And it started at the Rhode Island Historical Society, and then eventually moved by 1977 to the Opportunities Industrialization Center in the south side of Providence, which was this massive integrated Black institution, which was bringing together all people and organizations. From there, the Black Heritage Society grew. In fact, today, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society is one of the oldest existing and continually operating Black heritage institutions in America. It has over 9,000 cubic feet of collections dating back to the colonial era to the present day. They're housed in a building at the campus of Rhode Island College, which gives them a strategic partnership with not only Rhode Island College, but other colleges and universities and their archives and collections. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, for the most part, is under the wire because most of its work is collection management, archival work. They have a full-time archivist, research director. They work with historians, and they put on programs and exhibits like the Gilded Age Newport in Color, which has been very, very exciting. I give full kudos to my wife, the director, and her staff, because again, having so much collections like that, Trudy, you know this as the Preservation Society, most of the work that the visitor never gets to see is the hard work of restoring, preserving these intricate, fragile pieces of work. And the Black Heritage Society spends much of their resources doing exactly that. That gives us the opportunity to have a display like the Gilded Age of Newport in Color display.
right. And I want everybody to hear a little bit about this exhibition because I do think there are so many different stories and so many important people, Newporters, Black Newporters who have made significant impacts in the world. For example, the founding of the American Medical Association. Tell us about that.
Well, again,
I think that's just some things that people wouldn't even guess if they had to.
No, it's a great story, Trudy. By the late 19th century, you have 4 practicing African heritage medical professionals in Newport, 3 general doctors, and my great uncle was the first Black dentist in Rhode Island. At that time, if you were a person of color, and particularly a woman of color, your choices of advanced degrees and professional degrees and where you could attend and be accepted were limited. Thank goodness we had historically Black colleges and universities then and even to this day. So you had men like Dr. Marcus Wheatland, born in Barbados, a graduate of Howard Medical School. He arrives in Newport after his graduation by about 1895. He's friends with Dr. Alonzo Van Horn, his classmate at Howard, who is a Newport-born man. And he comes to Newport. His practice of specialty is using the X-ray, a brand new technology at that time, the X-ray machine. He deploys the X-ray as a diagnostic tool. No one has done this at this time. In fact, in his medical office in his home that still stands on John Street, he had 2 working X-ray machines in the late 19th century into the 20th century. There were only a handful across the country. So if you think in terms of that technology at that time, if you had a fall and you had a broken limb, all that they could do is take their hands and feel for the break and set it and hope for the best. With an X-ray, you could actually see exactly where the fracture was and then be able to provide the proper splint, the proper therapy, the proper support. He was the rage of the community. In fact, the elite families of Newport during the summer, as they were falling during polo matches and doing things that they did, would go directly to Van Horn for their ailments. The same senior citizens and older people that had tumors and had no idea how to isolate and recognize the tumor. My stomach hurts, my head hurts, my leg hurts. He could use the X-ray to actually isolate and identify where that tumor was. So he became, for the elite families, he was called the Doctor of the Swells. And there were New York Herald articles about him and how famous he was and recognized he was. At that time, he and Van Horn, along with a number of other Black physicians in Boston, Philadelphia, Newport, petitioned the American Medical Association. We are licensed, certified medical practitioners. We would like to be a part of this association. The response was, no, you cannot.
No,
Rather than
you
your
cannot be.
color, you
Yeah,
cannot be. Rather than worrying about or fighting or being rejected, they used their interdependent mind and thoughts and said, we will create our own medical certification institution. So they would be the leaders and the founders and the early presidents of the National Medical Association, which still exists to this day. That is an example of interdependence, of
yeah.
not letting racism, discrimination then or now stand in the way of their professional capabilities in their lives. And you see this as a theme across Newport at that time, creating our own institutions to benefit our own interest. I also want to point out with Dr. Wheatland, Dr. Van Horn, you also have Dr. Harriet Rice. Harriet Rice is Newport born. She's a
Yeah.
Rogers High School graduate. She becomes the first woman of color to graduate from Wellesley College. She goes on to get medical degrees at the University of Michigan, at the New York Children Family Medical Center, and becomes a physician active in her family home on 75 Spring Street. World War I breaks out. She wants to serve American troops. The United States government turns her down because she's both Black and a woman. She goes to the French embassy and says, can I help? The French says, we'd love to have you. She spends the entire World War I servicing wounded French troops in France. When she returns after the war, she receives the highest recognition of French government, the honor of gratitude. She returns after the war. She's practicing in Newport. She creates the Harriet Tubman House in Boston and spends her entire life, despite the discrimination based on sex and race, contributing as a medical professional. So we're very excited to the fact that the stories that we're able to tell of these Black leaders in the professions are really anchored to the fact that the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society has reams and reams of primary documents, photographs, letters, diaries, written works. We even have in our exhibit physical furniture and collections from the household and businesses of these men and women. Dr. Alonzo Van Horn, the first dentist we have on display, is 1899 dental equipment from
Right.
that time.
That is a showstopper, Keith.
It's exciting.
Everybody wants to look at that equipment. That was in your family, or was that at Rhode Island
Yes,
Black?
my great aunt donated that to the Newport Historical Society. Our goal has been to really keep these artifacts local. So having them at the Newport Historical Society, most importantly, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, by keeping them local, exhibits like this give us an opportunity to be able to bring it back into the community and demonstrate to the community how interesting, exciting people were at that time.
So, what really strikes me, well, there are so many other people who are, whose stories are told in this exhibit. So I hope you will feel free to, I have 1,000 questions. I want to talk a little bit about the whole concept of tourism and hospitality, because there were leaders of the Black community who were building their own hotels, creating their own restaurants here in Newport. They weren't, begrudgingly saying, I can't get into that hotel. No, they had their own beautiful hotel to go to because there were people talk a little bit about this emergence of the, this was a fancy community for all sorts of people going back.
I would have to say that if the Rhode Island hospitality community was to recognize possibly the most important influencer in launching hospitality and tourism in Rhode Island, you'd have to look to George Thomas Downing. George T. Downing was born in New York. His father, Thomas Downing, was a free African man from Philadelphia, went to New York, and by the 1830s and 40s, he would establish on Broad Street the largest and most successful restaurant in New York City, the Downing Oyster House. And the Downing Oyster House was by far the house and the restaurant and the meeting place of the elite Bohemian New Yorkers of that time, the leading family. He would literally use the technology of preserving oysters and shellfish by pickled and sometimes salt. Salt would be a problematic preservative because it took away the flavor. Pickled kept some of the flavor. I still can't today in the 21st century think of oysters being pickled or anything like that. But at the time, Downing's pickled oysters were the rage because they could preserve them. He could transport them. He even sent pickled oysters in ceramic jars to Queen Victoria in England, who in turn gave him a watch for his work and service. So by the 1850s, the elite of New York are literally giving Thomas Downing some intel, some intelligence. We're all looking at this place in the north called Newport, Rhode Island, and we're all having this discussion about building our summer homes there. We would love to have your restaurant and your services in Newport during the summer. So Thomas Downing tells his oldest son, George Downing, you need to set up in Newport, Rhode Island, and so we can begin to have a gateway of services to this place called Bellevue Avenue. In 1844, George Downing arrives. He buys property on what is called South Turrell Street, later to become Bellevue Avenue. South Turrell Street is what is today Bellevue Avenue across from Turrell Park. He sets up property. His father invests in him, and over the next several years starts to run carriage services to some of the earlier estates. As you know, Trudy, the first estates are not on Bellevue Avenue before the Civil War. It's really in Easton's Point, places like Catherine Street, Old Beach Road, Rhode Island Avenue, which old Newport is called Lover's Lane because of the trees that were there. But later, as South Turrell Street is expanding into Bellevue Avenue, George Downing and his father, Thomas Downing, build an early hotel, the Seagirt Hotel.
Seagirt, yeah.
The Seagirt Hotel is a front page feature article in the New York Herald in 1857.
And it is located where? Where is it located?
It would be located today in what is called the Downing Block. So between Downing Street and and it runs to about Du Bois Street today on Bellevue Avenue, across from Turrell.
Right.
It is a hugely popular hotel. He's running catering services. He's running all types of hospitality service of the hotel. It's rivaling the Ocean House and Atlantic House, which are two other additional hotels.
Right, down the street.
Bellevue and Pelham, and then
Right.
further on what is today the Bowery Street in Bellevue Avenue. It burns down suspiciously by fire, but they have it fully insured, and they use the insurance to rebuild to create what becomes the Downing Block, which George Downing operates. George Downing is now connecting with other Black entrepreneurs, and he starts to suggest, come to Newport. A Benjamin Burton from Connecticut comes to Newport. He operates the first public transportation system in the 1850s in Newport. He also creates what is called the Benjamin Burton Original Oriental Express Transfer Company. He is the first bonded express company that would literally send carriages and wagons to Long Wharf Mall, meeting steamships coming from Providence, and then would be able to carry the luggage of the elite families directly to their estates on the avenue. He dominated that industry. He employed dozens of Black men and women to work within that industry. He also reached out to a Mary H. Dickerson, another Connecticut woman. She arrives by 1875. She's a dress designer and dressmaker. She sets up her business in the Travelers Block, one of the historic commercial buildings of that time. The two most important commercial buildings on Bellevue Avenue, Gilded Age, are the Downing Block and the Travelers Block. Benjamin Burton, Mary Dickerson have business operations in the Travelers Block, adjacent to the Tennis Hall of Fame, adjacent to the casino. Mary Dickerson becomes the lead designer and dressmaker for the leading women for their gowns in the summer in Newport. And she's hiring other African heritage women to be dressmakers and designers. What's important about this story is Wheatland, Burton, Dickerson become very wealthy. They own dozens of properties all across Newport. They take their money, and this is important, and they create what we call a new type of American capitalism. Rather than taking their wealth and investing into themselves, they take their wealth and invest in the broader community. They're setting up civil rights organizations. Mary Dickerson is a founder of the National Colored Women's Clubs. She founds the Newport Women's League in Newport. They're championing Black women's rights. They're championing social welfare issues. They're fighting lynchings in the South. So what's important here is that these wealthy Black entrepreneurs of Newport are using that wealth to create and expand a larger and most important thriving Black community. And that's why we call it a new type and probably the most appropriate American capitalism, where everyone benefits.
And Mary Dickerson was a dressmaker to whom everybody went. the swells on Bellevue Avenue who wanted the fanciest dress in town, they'd go to Mary Dickerson, and she would provide them with Parisian looks that nobody else could provide.
She was advertising for having all the French patterns and such coming into Newport. It was quite amazing. And I think one of the more popular aspects of the exhibit, we've taken the 1903 photograph of Mary Dickinson and four other ladies who were the executive committee of the Newport Women's League. That photograph was organized by William E.B. Du Bois. He did that strategically because he was asked during the Paris World Exposition of that year to showcase the success of Blacks in America. He spent most of his time taking photographs of Newport people. So that photograph of Mary Dickinson in the executive committee of the Women's League, which was photographed in Newport, as you know, Trudy, we've blown it up to the entire size of the wall because we wanted to show that these are women of color who achieved success larger than life during a time that people would not normally suspect as a time of achievement. I can tell you, as I've gone through the exhibit, I love the fact that young women and young girls of all colors get in front of that picture and take selfies in front of it. You can see the pride. You can see the sense of joy and excitement that they someday could be a Mary Dickinson.
Right.
And that means that the exhibit's successful. If we're connecting people at that level with a historical person, an historical experience, we know we've been successful.
Well, I think it's true. I do hope that everybody listening to this program will take time and go to Rosecliff, because you will get a new story about Newport that you probably did not have in your minds. It's a fascinating one. I have to ask, it's, I guess, borders on being political, but it is confusing to me, Keith. Why in America are we so ignorant about how important Black heritage communities have been going back for years? How significant, what kinds of contributions have been made? Why is it that here we are in 2024 having an exhibit at Rosecliff telling this story when it could have been told 100 years ago?
I think the challenge that we have today in 2024 is social media. We're not extracting our historical information from primary factual sources like libraries, historical institutions, and preservation societies and scholars. We're Wikipediaing it. We're going on to the internet looking for this information, which may not be accurate, or it tends to be very generalized. The fact that we have to have a Black History Month is always odd to me, that 1 month of the year, the shortest month of the year, is Black History Month, when this is not Black history, it's American history. If we're telling the story of Gilded Age Newport in color, we're telling yet another unique aspect of Newport's history, the Gilded Age history. And these men and women, in fact, Marcus Wheatland had an incredible speech in 1907 that was printed in the Colored American, the largest newspaper at that time, where he's telling young graduates of historically Black colleges and universities, don't think of yourself as a colored man or a colored woman. You're a man, you're a woman. You have capabilities and education and resources that you have every right to share with the world, and you have to think that way and have that same sense of identity. That still is very relevant to this day.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
One of the challenges is that the stories that we're presenting are only new because the larger commercial markets, be it media markets, are lazy. They want to default to the easy history that's right at their fingertips. They'll always talk about Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, when all those men and women were predated by people like Reverend Mahlon Van Horn of Newport. Reverend Mahlon Van Horn in Newport is the minister of the Union Colored Congregational Church for 30 years. That church evolved directly from the African Union Society. It's one of the earliest free Black churches in America. Not in the South, not in the Midwest, but in Newport, Rhode Island. Mahlon Van Horn, by 1872, he's the first person of color on a Newport school board. He helps to integrate schools in Rhode Island. By 1885, he's the first person of color elected to the Rhode Island General Assembly. By 1898, President McKinley appoints him as general counsel to the Danish West Indies, which is today the U.S. Virgin Islands. He's a Renaissance man of his time. In fact, before Martin Luther King, it is Reverend Van Horn that blends politics and the pulpit and uses the Black church as a center of advancing not only Black religious life, but social and political life. So if you think about Martin Luther King today, you have to understand that there were men like Reverend Van Horn in Newport, Rhode Island, that predated him over generations. So the more you know about Van Horn, the more you know about King, and the more you know about Van Horn and King, the more you know about the evolution of civil rights in America that we all benefit from, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation. We all
But it
benefit.
is amazing that it's a very slow process, and it has not been easy stories for people to even know exist. I have to ask you, because we only have about 2 minutes left, sorry. Your family has held on to things for 9 generations. Most of us, Keith, can't wait to get rid of old things in our houses. What is it in the DNA of the Stokes family that has, because many of the objects in the exhibit come from your family itself. It's extraordinary. Why did you do this?
I think, I mean, my maternal grandfather was part of the early enslaved and free African communities of Newport in America. My maternal grandmother was a part of the earliest Jewish settlers and families of Newport in America. And in both cases, they felt very strongly that the larger society didn't recognize our American story. I mean, you couldn't go to a public library, a public school, and hear about early American Jewish history, or certainly hear about early American Black history. So it was up to ourselves, it was up to our synagogues, our churches, our families to keep this history alive. And I was just very fortunate to be a part of that system. The items that we have were sacred to us because it gave us a sense of this is our story. We have every right to succeed in Newport, Rhode Island, or America because we were here as early or earlier than most.
Right.
And it's my grandmother that said something when I was very little. She would take me to the Redwood Library, the Newport Public Library, show me books. We had lots of books from her family collection. But one of the things that she used to say to me as a child that resonates today is that slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our ancestors survived and thrived slavery. So she really instilled in me is talk about how we thrived and survived, emphasize how we're still here and succeeding, and talk about people like Mary Dickerson and George Downing, who were all her friends, Rice. They were friends of my grandparents and great-grandparents and great-uncles. So they knew those people. They were friends. They were in and out of the house. They shared photographs with them, furniture. So we had that. So I just try to carry that and pay that forward. I want all Americans, and particularly Americans of color, and now newly arriving immigrants. I mean, one interesting fact, there are more African born in Rhode Island than African American. There are more Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latinos than African American. So their stories have to be told. And they're as equally important as someone who happens to be American born. And I'm just so excited to be able to, again, pay this forward today.
Well, that couldn't be a better ending to today's radio show because you epitomize the history of African heritage people. We're so really in Newport, so very fortunate to have you, Keith, and your family and your commitment, and it's great. So thank you very much. And we will tune in. Keith is going to be giving a speech. So if you're interested in hearing Keith talk further, Am I Not a Man and a Woman? The Rise of African Heritage Political Identity in Gilded Age, Rhode Island, May 16th, with his wife, Theresa. So thank you very much, Keith, and we'll talk again.
Thank you, Trudy.